All right, so Marianne Williamson, one of the only challengers to Biden's re-election chances in 2024, recently decided to sit down and do an interview with MSNBC's Mehdi Hasan, who is kind of a conflicting character because sometimes he seems to just be totally in defense of the status quo of the Democratic Party, and sometimes he actually breaks away and has some decent takes on like healthcare policy or whatever the case may be. So it's an interesting dynamic here between them, but in this one, he's basically just going to go full throttle in trying to smear Marianne Williamson as some sort of a spoiler or somebody who is not realistic in even launching this campaign for president. So let's just go ahead and jump into this and we'll break it down as we go.
So what do you say to those who point out that, yes, you are popular with younger voters and on TikTok, but you can't win a Democratic presidential primary? You're essentially a spoiler candidate. And so by primarying Biden, all you're doing is weakening him in the general and making it easier for a Republican to beat him in 2024 in what will be a very tight election.
Okay, first of all, I mean, she's going to give the obvious response to this, and she gives a better response than I would. But essentially, I mean, he's alleging that she is a spoiler candidate, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever at face value, because a spoiler candidate, just like by definition in the way that it's usually used, is somebody who would have, maybe run against Joe Biden in the general election. Like if Marianne decided to run against him as a third party or as a Green Party candidate after she loses the primary to him, then you could say, okay, maybe that is a spoiler. I wouldn't even necessarily be against her doing that, but there is no way that you can possibly say that a spoiler candidate is somebody who is in the Democratic primary against another Democratic opponent. I mean, that's just the Democratic process that you're describing there, but you're just, again, pretending as if anybody challenging Joe Biden, who has horrendous poll numbers right now, is somehow a threat that is going to lead to an increased chance of Republicans winning. But she responds here.
Well, there are two things about what you said. First of all, you said I'm a spoiler candidate. I'm not a spoiler candidate. I'm running in a primary. So you can't be a spoiler if you're running in the primary. The second thing you said was this narrative you can't win. Isn't that what people said about Donald Trump? I will win if people vote for me. I believe that in a democracy, people should have as wide an array of options before them as there are candidates running on agendas. That's what a democracy is. We need to protect our democracy right now. That's obvious to everyone. The way you protect your democracy is by using your democracy. Candidate suppression is a form of voter suppression. So this idea that I'm a spoiler, no, I'm not a spoiler. I'm a candidate in a primary, and it's very important, I believe, that the president debate me, that the president debate any other people who are challenging him. At a time like this, when the fascists are clearly at the door, we should be having a very serious conversation about what it will take to defeat them, and not just accepting what the DNC has to say because a few elites have decided it's going to be Joe Biden.
I mean, she's 100% correct. That is literally exactly what's happening right now. And not only is he not willing to debate Marianne or RFK Jr., who I'm not even a fan of, but like Joe Biden and all of his surrounding people who work for his campaign are basically just laughing off the notion of even having a discussion about a primary where some of these people, I mean, RFK Jr. in some polls has been as high as like 20%. Marianne has been as high as 11%. It's not as if they're polling at 0.1%. And so it is kind of just a laughable campaign. No, they're real challengers. People obviously, according to the other polling data that we have, aren't in support of Joe Biden running again. It's a vast majority that don't want him to run again. And so why is it like a laughable, a laughable proposal that you would even have a debate with them or run a campaign against them? And this is part of what Joe Biden's campaign has also screwed himself over on, which is absolutely hilarious, by also trying to rig the Democratic primary by making South Carolina a state that's not even competitive for Democrats nationally anymore, making that the first state to vote. And it just so happens that Joe Biden has deep connections there with like Jim Clyburn, and it also just so happens that South Carolina was a state that ended up swinging the momentum back in the 2020 primary when Bernie Sanders won the first three states. I mean, it's like they're just transparent about it, and this is the same party that is basically using the main selling point that they are a bulwark against the more authoritarian fascist Republicans. And that's not even like a incorrect analysis of the threat of the Republican Party, but it's like you can't pretend to be the vanguard defenders of democracy when you're not even willing to pretend to have democracy within your own party. And I mean, again, 2016, you could go back to, the race against Hillary Clinton with Bernie Sanders. The DNC has openly said, okay, that they believe that they have the right to rig their primaries or to make massive preferential or give massive preferential treatment to the person who they want to win, whether that's Joe Biden, whether that's Hillary Clinton, or whether it's Joe Biden running again and now has challengers. But I mean, again, how are you going to pretend to want to defeat fascism and authoritarianism, and then you're laughing at the idea of democracy when it comes to a primary contest? I mean, it's just ridiculous, but they continue here.
Well, if you're a viewer of the show, and I don't know if you are or not, I'm very clear about the fascist threat, which is why I worry about a divided opposition to a fascist threat. And just to be clear, you're right, Donald Trump did win against expectations. But to be fair, Donald Trump entered the 2016 race and led in the polls throughout. I think there was one brief moment where Ben Carson overtook him. Otherwise, he led the entire time. You got, correct me if I'm wrong, you never went above more than 1% in the polls in 2020. So I have to ask, what makes you think 4 years later, yes, now is my time?
Okay, first of all, I've been up to 11% this time, right? That's number one. And number two, there is an ameliorative effect in somebody telling the truth. Somebody needs to tell the truth about this country, which the American people know. Please remember, Mehdi, 70% of the American people do not want him to run again. The American people, you have 70% of the American people who live with chronic economic anxiety. You have 64% of Americans who cannot absorb a $400 unexpected expenditure. We have 60% of Americans who are living paycheck to paycheck. 1 in 4 Americans live medical debt. You have 18 million Americans who cannot even afford to pay for the prescriptions that their doctors give them.
Agree on all of that. So what are you proposing to do that's different to Joe Biden? Briefly explain to our viewers, what is your policy platform, briefly?
My policy platform is that the American people should have an opportunity for an economic U-turn, for fundamental economic reform. We should have the same things that every other advanced democracy has. We should have universal health care. We should have free college tuition and tech school. We should have free child care. We should have paid family leave. We should have guaranteed sick pay, and we should have a guaranteed living wage. We should have an economic bill of rights. We have a country where there has been a massive transfer of wealth into the hands of 1% of our people. It has completely destroyed our middle class, and it is now baked into the cake of how our political system operates, that we will continue to make it easier for people who already have to get more and everyone else to struggle to make it. The majority of Americans live with constant economic anxiety in the richest country in the world.
Okay. I mean, again, she's 100% correct, and it's kind of weird to me, unless Mehdi Hasan doesn't really believe a lot of the other things that he advocates for, because I've seen him make arguments, I'm pretty sure, for things like Medicare for All, and maybe even like the Green New Deal. Like, he's not purely ideologically like, a Joe Biden supporter, I don't think, but I think he's just getting that institutional brain rot, or that MSNBC sort of like mainstream status quo managerial brain rot, where he just thinks that, anybody who's challenging the current president must be an absolute joke. And he threw out so many different straw mans throughout that. I mean, like, oh, you only got up to 1% in 2020. Well, we're not talking about 2020 when you have 20 different candidates standing on the stage and nobody knew really who Marianne Williamson was within the political sphere. I mean, we're not talking about that. We're talking about a completely different situation. And, finally at the end, he asked about her policy disagreements, and she absolutely kills it. And so we're going to get to a little bit of her economic Bill of Rights that she recently unveiled, which, again, I think is an absolutely great thing. It harkens back, obviously, to the FDR days, where he was trying to push forward with an economic Bill of Rights, and basically that's what her main core economic policy platform is. And it's definitely differentiated from Joe Biden. I mean, come on, we're talking about a guy who let the Senate parliamentarian tank the prospects of a $15 minimum wage. We're talking about a guy who allowed millions of people to be kicked off of Medicaid under his watch. I mean, so many different examples we could give where Joe Biden is just trying to do like whatever the least insane Republicans will allow him to do, or whatever the most corporate, ghoulish people within his own party like Sinema and Manchin will allow him to do. We don't want that. We want something more structural. We want actual fundamental change at a ground level, and clearly that's reflected in the fact that we have polling data that even now CNN ghouls like Jake Tapper are admitting are absolutely atrocious. Let's just watch this short clip here.
Horrible news. Horrible for Joe Biden in our new CNN poll. While the president leads his Democratic competitors by a huge margin, 2/3 of all of the American people surveyed, 66% of the public, say that a Biden victory would either be a setback or a disaster for the United States.
Okay. I mean, again, it would be one thing if Joe Biden had like a 50% approval rating and the overwhelming majority of Democrats even wanted him to run again. That's not the reality. So clearly there's a mismatch here that you in the media, like Jake Tapper, you in the media, like Mehdi Hasan, are helping to perpetuate. Okay, there's a mismatch between how popular Joe Biden is and how much people actually want him to run again versus the potential legitimacy that you guys are giving to actual challengers of Joe Biden. If you guys are just constantly smearing these people as outsider, ridiculous, unserious, absolutely no chance at winning type of candidates, then of course people are not going to be exposed to their ideas as much, and they're not going to be confident in the fact that, hey, maybe there could be an alternative candidate that would actually be better for Democrats in the 2024 race against Trump or DeSantis, but probably Trump, depending on who ends up winning that contest. But that gets down to like one of my core issues with this entire analysis that the mainstream media gives when it comes to issues like this, and it's that they bake in this false assumption that somehow like Joe Biden, or challenging Joe Biden is going to increase the likelihood of Republicans winning in 2024, that it's going to create some sort of irreparable divide within the Democratic Party that is going to lead to him losing. And what they don't understand is that if you look at the current polling data now of head-to-head matchups of Joe Biden against Trump, who's his most likely competitor, or even Ron DeSantis, Joe Biden is getting smoked in some of these polls. Okay, there was a recent poll that came out, Joe Biden was down by like 6 or 7 percentage points to Donald Trump. So clearly the pathway that you guys are advocating for right now of just putting your full faith behind Joe Biden without even having a debate from a more left-wing perspective, that is the pathway that is going to lead to an increased likelihood of you losing in 2024. And for somebody like Mehdi Hasan, who is so worried about the fascist threat of the Republican Party, you would think that you would just try to have an objective analysis of what actually would be better for the country, right? If young people tend to like Marianne Williamson because she's proposing things like this, the economic Bill of Rights, okay, and young people are the reason why Democrats didn't get wiped in the 2022 midterms, and that they successfully took out Donald Trump in 2020 in the 2020 election, then maybe you should do some reflecting on that instead of just disregarding your base of supporters or an entire generation of people like that, okay, and actually take them seriously, have a debate. And even if Marianne Williamson doesn't end up winning the Democratic primary, because I acknowledge obviously she doesn't have a very high chance of winning, it's incredibly difficult to beat an incumbent, especially with all of this pressure from the media and from the party itself. But even if they have that debate, that could shift the Overton window. You could form some sort of maybe a deal between these candidates in exchange for their endorsement, something I wish Bernie Sanders did back in 2020. I mean, you can have the opportunity to influence the Overton window of discussion and debate on policy and what is considered, acceptable for even a Joe Biden candidacy, and that would help to energize the very people who you are now disregarding. I mean, it's just a completely absurd notion, and every single premise that he's laying out there is just false if you look at the actual data on this. But so now I want to get to just a little bit of the highlights in terms of what Marianne's economic Bill of Rights actually is. We're just going to run through these just so you guys can get an idea. I'll link it down below in the description as usual for all of my sources if you guys want to go and read the actual details. But she starts off here. She says, number 1, the right to a job that pays a living wage. Number 2, the right to a voice in the workplace through a union and collective bargaining. Great. The right to universal quality health care, the right to a cost-free higher education, the right to good, affordable housing, the right to a clean environment and a healthy planet, the right to a meaningful endowment of resources at birth. She's very big on like the child care stuff, especially, which is great and actually would be electorally better for Democrats to focus a lot on that. They say the right to sound banking and financial services, the right to an equitable and fair justice system, and the right to cultural and civic involvement in a democratic life. So, I mean, listen, you can go and read the specifics on that. I mean, I don't agree with 100% of her platform, obviously, but I mean, this is infinitely better than anything that Joe Biden, who wanted to pretend to be the FDR 2.0 type of president, okay, it's infinitely better than anything that he's been able to get done, or even stuff that he promised, okay? So, I mean, listen, we're going to keep getting this from the media. Marianne is going to keep having to put up with this, but, it makes it that much more important that, like, we actually push to get her policy ideas out there and to try to change the narrative at least a little bit so that, people don't have this reactionary, engagement with this type of a situation and just act as if there is no potential alternative to the status quo, who is doing absolutely disastrously.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me. Everyone is saying